you. You're unmuted. You are unmuted, Rabbi.
Right, I am unmuted. Yes. Good morning, everyone.
Lovely.
Nice to see you all again. And recovering from Yom Tov, getting back into Acharei HaChagim. There's a new concept, a new planet of Acharei HaChagim, when life sort of returns to its regular course. Okay, just to remind you, the theme of our shiurim, our Tuesday morning shiurim, for quite a few months already, has been a closer look at Sefer Bereshis, with a particular view of understanding in what way the book of Bereshis really is the foundations of the whole of Jewish history. Everything that happened subsequently in Klal Yisrael already exists in Bereshis in potential. It's bekoyach. In other words, it hasn't yet played itself out, but the roots of the future of Klal Yisrael are all in Sefer Bereshis in the most remarkable way. And we've looked at quite a few aspects of that already. It's nice to see everyone here coming back into the Shia, and we're going to continue today looking at Bereshis chapter 15. But let me give you just a bit of an introduction to this chapter, which is something very fascinating. That in Sefer Bereshis, HaKadosh Baruch Hu not only communicates with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but he engages in something of supreme importance, which is the foundation of the future of the Jewish people, which is a covenant. The concept of a bris is a central theme in the whole of the Tanakh. And what exactly does a covenant mean? A covenant is obviously an agreement between two sides, but a covenant is very different, say, to a contract. A contract is an agreement between two sides, where if one party breaks his side of the contract is broken, and then the other party is no longer obligated to fulfill his obligations. A bris, a covenant, is understood as something different. A covenant is something which has something indestructible about it, and in that sense is really has an eternal dimension to it. In other words, the real covenants are only really covenants with God. Human beings are unreliable and in a certain sense unpredictable, and circumstances change. And I can make a contract with you to agree to engage in a certain activity together. And a couple of years down the line, my circumstances can change and I can no longer fulfill my side of the contract, and therefore the contract is void. But a covenant is not like that. A covenant is an eternal agreement between two sides, and in particularly in a covenant with God. What was the first covenant in the book of Bereshis? Anybody know the first covenant? With whom did God make his very first covenant? For 5 points, ladies and gentlemen. With whom did God make his first covenant? Beg your pardon?
Adam.
Any offers?
No.
Noach.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
To
you,
the
Phil.
marble.
I see, Phil, you've had your Weetabix this morning, Phil. You're absolutely right. The first covenant is with Noach. Noach comes out of the Teva in Bereshis chapter 9, and God makes with him a covenant that he will never again destroy the world like he did in the flood. And this is considered to be the very first covenant that God makes with mankind. And the whole idea of a covenant with mankind is one of the most remarkable features of the whole of the Tanakh. The idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in some way committed himself irrevocably. The idea of an irrevocable commitment is something which in the human world is almost unheard of. And it's really unrealistic. You can't make an irrevocable commitment because you don't know what your circumstances will be a few years down the line. That's why when you make a neder, for example, you make an oath, the Torah gives us the facility of Hatoras Nadorim. What is Hatoras Nadorim? Hatoras Nadorim is when you come to a Chacham or to a Bezdin and you say, it's true, I made this oath, and when I made it, I meant it, but circumstances have changed and I can no longer do it. I can no longer keep this Neder or this Shavua, and therefore you can be Matir Neder. But the idea of being Matir Neder is very much a reflection of, I'm going to cut here, is very much a reflection of human changing conditions, that no contract or promise can be really irrevocable because circumstances can change. However, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the connection we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and even the connection that man, don't forget, the bris that Noach makes with God is not a Jewish issue. It's a connection with mankind. God is making a commitment to mankind not to destroy the world again. What's interesting is the Torah doesn't actually spell out in detail what was it exactly that Noach committed himself to. And don't forget, whenever you have a contract or a covenant, both sides commit themselves to each other, right? So in the covenant to Noach, God commits himself to Noach, but what does Noach commit himself to? Chazal tell us, does anybody know what is it that Noach actually commits himself to? According to Chazal, anybody got any ideas? What might it have been that Noach was asked to commit himself to in order to create this covenant? So the answer to that, according to the Gemara, it's not in the text, but according to Chazal, according to the Gemara, the commitment of Noach was the 7 Noachide laws, the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. The Sheva Mitzvahs, in other words, Noach committed himself to a basic moral code. A moral code. In other words, the 7 Noachide laws are the most minimal, if you like, the most minimal moral code in the Torah, right? It's a belief in God, and based on a belief in God, a commitment not to engage in moral crimes, right? Theft, murder, adultery, these sort of things are all part of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. So that is really bris number 1, right? And that's really the ground floor, if you like, a covenant that God has with mankind. What we're going to be looking at now today is Bereshis chapter 15, which is the second covenant in the Chumash, right? The second covenant in the Chumash. One could actually learn the whole Chumash as a series of covenants, right? There are pretty much 5 separate covenants in the Chumash, and really the whole Chumash revolves around these covenants, the content of these covenants, the direction of these covenants, and what they are designed to achieve. The last covenant will be in Messianic times, right? When the Nevi'im speak about a bris chadosha, there will be a new covenant with mankind and with the Jewish people in Yemos HaMashiach. But that's not our topic for today. What we're going to be looking at is the second covenant in the Chumash, which is referred to as the Bris Bein HaBesorim, which is Bereshis chapter 15. And we're going to have a bit of a closer look at it, right? In Parshas, what's interesting is Parshas Lech Lecha. This is Parshas Lech Lecha. And as I said to you before, everything that happens for the Jewish people is rooted in Sefer Bereshis, and particularly Parshas Lech Lecha with Avraham Avinu gives us really the foundational blocks of the whole of Jewish history and Judaism. So let's have a look in chapter 15. Avraham Avinu has just received a promise, is receiving a promise from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he will not remain childless. Here he is right? Here he is. I mean, don't forget, Yitzchak is only born to him when he is 100 years old, right? So here, it's only at the age of, here he is, not yet, he's already very advanced in age, and he's getting a covenant from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he will have children, but this particular covenant has lots of very interesting features about it. Let's read a few psukim, and let's look at some of the Divrei Chazal and see what we can find out of this covenant. Okay, let's see if I can do 1 second. Okay, how are we doing? See a screen? Yes? The Bris Bein HaBasarim, the Brit Bein HaBatarim, right? And in actual fact, this first covenant with Avram is really the origins of the connection the Jewish people have with the land of Israel. And it's very interesting that this is really before he gets the second covenant that Avram gets at the end of Lech Lecha is the Bris Milah, is the circumcision, which is a personal covenant between Avram and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Vayisi lecha le'elokim, that is the covenant of the Bris Milah. This covenant is not personal so much as national. But of course, it's personal in the sense that it's a covenant with Avram, the person, the individual, but it's in Avram's capacity as the patriarch of the future Jewish people. So we've already looked at one or two details here, because I remember the last few shiurim we had before Pesach, we spoke about the Haggadah, and one of the psukim here is a pasuk that appears in the Haggadah. Let's just have a quick look here at some of the psukim. Right after these events, HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears to Avram b'machazeh. A machazeh is a vision, right? The word chozeh, chozeh means a visionary, right? In modern Hebrew, I think they use the word machazeh to mean anyone know what machazeh means in Ivrit? If I'm not mistaken.
A play.
A play, that's right. A play on the theater. A theater play in modern Hebrew. So this word has been totally secularized into the theater and the arts. But in its origin, it means a prophetic vision. It means a vision of things which don't exist yet, but will exist in the future. So he says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears to Avram, and he says to him, Altira Avram, do not be afraid. Onochi mogein loch. And the word mogein is also crucial here in this pasuk, because we borrow this word mogein as the first bracha in every Shemona Esrei that we say 365 days a year. Baruch atah Hashem mogein Avraham. The mogein Avraham is an allusion to this covenant. And that's that's why learning Chumash and linking it up with our tefillas is extremely important. Because when Chazal gave us the text of the Siddur, for example, which was written by Ezra and the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, what they did was they were weaving into the text of the tefillah different threads of psukim and parts of psukim from the Chumash, on the assumption that the reader has these associations in his mind. So when you say Baruch Atah Hashem Mogen Avraham, there should be an association in your head with the Bris Bein HaBasarim. This Mogen, the protection of Avraham, and here the implication is whatever I'm about to promise you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I guarantee that this promise is protected. It's guaranteed. I am going to be your guarantor. I'm going to be your shield, literally a shield, a protection from negativity. Okay, so Abraham says, we've looked at this passage before. Abraham says, what are you going to give me? I have no children. So he says, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to him here in this passage, Lo Yerosh Chazeh, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to him, you will have a child, ki im asher yetze mime'echa hu yerushecha, the person who will inherit you will indeed be your offspring. Right? That's his promise. But Avraham Avinu is already very advanced in years and seems to have come to the conclusion that in the laws of nature, he will never ever have a child, right? That he and his wife are both pathologically incapable of having children. And at this point, we get this important phrase here, Vayotze oso hachutza. HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes him outside, right? He takes him outside. And what does it mean he takes him outside? Why are we interested whether he's out inside or outside? Generally speaking, when any of the Nevi'im have a prophetic communication, we're not told whether they're sitting down or standing up, or they're inside or outside, or the sun is shining, or we're not given these details. And yet here it says, Vayotze osa achutza, right? This phrase here, Vayotze osa achutza. This is a very important phrase. This is the crucial phrase at the first part of this chapter. And he says to him, I want you to go outside and look at the Shamayim, right? And he says to him, Ko yezarecha. So here Chazal say something very interesting about this, which I think I've mentioned to you before, but it's worth looking at again very briefly. Right here, it's a Gemara in Shabbos. So the Gemara in Shabbos, Kuf Nun Vav, V'af Rav Sovar, Ein Mazel Yisrael. Rav said, Ein Mazel Yisrael is a very interesting phrase. It means the destiny of the Jewish people is not dependent on mazel. It's not dependent on the laws of nature or changing circumstances. It's not dependent on that. Why is it not dependent? So here's a very interesting thing: the Ein Mazel Yisrael. I think we have discussed this once or twice before this year. Do you remember that, Eli? Do you remember that? Ein Mazel Yisrael, the question of Mazel Yisrael. I do remember actually mentioning as an aside in this year, I think it was this year, that I'm always amazed that the phrase Mazel Tov that we have to each other on a simcha is so common. And in actual fact, Mazel Tov shouldn't be the wish that we wish each other, because the actual mazel implies a certain good fortune or good fate, right, or good luck, right? That's what mazel means. But whereas Chazal tell us that actually the destiny of every member of Klal Yisrael is hashgacha pratis. We have a direct relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and certainly as a nation, we don't have mazel is not what is guiding and crucial for the future of the Jewish people. But look what Rav says. Rav says it's very interesting. How do I know Ein Mazel Yisrael? Where can I bring a proof of the text? To Amar of Yehuda Marav. Rav said, Minayin she'ein Mazel Yisrael. How do I know this? Shanema vayotze oso hachutza. This phrase, right? This phrase vayotze oso hachutza was understood by Chazal to mean he took him outside. Didn't mean outside the tent or outside the house or outside any sort of enclosure. It meant he took Avraham outside of the whole system of natural cause and effect and of changing circumstances. And he took him outside of all that. And he said that the promise I'm about to give you is not part of the laws of nature, and it's not part of the natural sort of series of events and their consequences which take place in the world, right? The natural historical line of the development of nations, the rise and the fall of nations. What we're going to be dealing with is something hachutza, which is outside of it all. So he says the Gemara, Oma Avraham lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ribono Shel Olam. The promise that he gave to him would be that his own children would be his descendants and that they would actually inherit. What would they inherit? We'll see in a minute, the land of Israel. What's interesting here is a Rashi. What does it mean? The crucial phrase in this Gemara is Ein Mazel Yisrael, that shall we say, the destiny of the Jewish people is not dependent simply on luck or on fortune or on circumstances. But look at this interesting Rashi. I find this Rashi very interesting. Ein Mazel Yisrael. What does Rashi say here? It means the al yedei tefillah u'zuchus mishtane mazolo l'tova. So what's Rashi saying here? Anybody have any comments here on what this Rashi could mean? What is Rashi saying here? Al yedei tefillah u'zuchus mishtane mazolo l'tova. So Rashi is saying, I believe, is that of course the destiny of every individual and of the nation of Israel is influenced by the laws of nature and by circumstances and by good fortune and good mazel. All these things, of course, do exist. But Rashi says that Klal Yisrael are given an override capacity, that we can override the mazel, that we can transcend the mazel. Very fascinating Rashi. Have a look at this Rashi in the screen that I've highlighted. A one-line Rashi with 7 words. Al yedei tefillah, that through our ability to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and have that direct connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, uzuchus. Zuchus means the merit of mitzvah and Talmud Torah and chesed and emunah, the merits that Klal Yisrael have got, the spiritual merits, because of the tefillah and the zechuyos, mishtane mazolo l'tova. A person's circumstances can be transformed positively. In other words, of course, we're subject to circumstances. And if a person doesn't engage in tefillah and doesn't have a zechus, then we are part of the natural world. In other words, hashgacha protis is not something which is fixed in this world, that everything that we do and happens to us and everything is automatically specially tailor-made for us from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what Rashi is saying. Rashi saying, of course, there's Mazel Yisrael. And of course, there are circumstances which affect us, and national circumstances, economic circumstances, I don't know, a person's health circumstance, all that can affect us. But there is something that we can do. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving us a gift of spiritual zechuyot, of the spiritual zechus of mitzvahs, of Torah, of chesed, and of davening, and that can override all these circumstances, and that is vayotze osa hachutza. So all this is part of what will be the covenant that we're going to see in a minute that Avraham Avinu gets from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because he asks an interesting question. Avraham asks an interesting question here. Have a look here. Right, so at a certain point here, chapter 15, the truth is we're really just scratching the surface of chapter 15. And chapter 15 itself is something we could learn for weeks. I'd like just to pick up a couple of things. So at a certain point, Avram asks the following difficult question. So Avram responds to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's just got a promise that he will have children, and that they will be his heirs, and they will be his continuity. So he says, Vayomar, and he says, Hashem Elokim, Bamo Eidat Ki Hiroshem. How will I know? What sort of question is that? How will I know? How will I know that indeed, right, that I will inherit the land of Israel, that my children will inherit the land of Israel, that they will be my spiritual and national heirs? How do I know that? So what's he really asking here? Anybody got any idea what really is this question? HaKadosh Baruch Hu just told him, right? So what does it mean by Mo'edah? How will I know that this will indeed happen? This question
Can I come in on that?
Yes.
When HaKadosh Baruch Hu says him say Hachutza, I think all the Mefarshim are saying that you have to give up all your ideas of what you've known in the past, all the astrology that you've looked up.
Correct.
Forget all that and think outside the box. That's why he changed his name. Kadosh Baruch Hu changed him from Avram to Avram, because as Avram, we couldn't inherit the land. He couldn't have a son. As Avraham, we could. That was the difference.
First of all, that's a very interesting point, Michael. You're quite right. The whole idea of Shinui Hashem, that changing a person's name can affect their destiny in some sense, comes from here, of course. You're quite right. Avram becomes Avraham, right? But that's a little bit of a play on words. That the essential feature here is that having received the promise from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he's being told that indeed he's a human being in a physical world, subject to all sorts of circumstances. But as Klal Yisrael, we also have another override button. And the override button is our connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is the tefillah and the zechus of Klal Yisrael. So what's Avraham here? So what's he asking now here, Michael, when he says, how do I know this is going to happen? What's he asking? So this is an interesting, yes?
Avraham Avinu can't see the future, and he's relying on HaKadosh Baruch Hu to tell him what's going to happen.
Yes. He can't see the future. And I think you have to add here, he can't see the future, and he also can't see what type of descendants he's going to have. What are the generations going to look like? In other words, will his descendants actually maintain a level of emunah and a level of mitzvahs which will give them the ability to receive that blessing from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, it's all going to depend on what sort of people they are. Now, Avram here is not questioning God. God has just promised him something's going to happen. But what he's questioning is, how do I know that my descendants are going to be, what's the right word here? They're going to be...
Shomrei Torah mitzvahs.
Yes, will they be worthy? Yes, will they really be connected to the spiritual Torah and mitzvahs? Of course, it's before Sinai. There is no Torah yet. There are no real mitzvahs yet. But let's just say Avraham Avinu is teaching a message to mankind. What was Avraham Avinu's message? Was a combination of two things. Was a combination of emunah, a belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that we live in God's world, and what we receive as a gift from God, and chesed. Right? Avraham Avinu represents chesed. Right? The chesed that he's committed to looking after others and giving others and being dedicated to helping others. So the combination of emunah and chesed for Avraham Avinu, that was the spiritual pillars of his world. So when he's asking, Bamo Eida Hiroshana, he's really asking, how can I be sure that my children and my children's children, Ad Sof Kol Hadoros, and all future generations, how can I be sure they are going to maintain that link to emunah, chesed, and eventually mitzvahs? So he's asking really
Can I say my opinion?
Sorry?
I would like to express my opinion also.
Please go.
Yes. I think that Abraham asking two things. First, if he will be alive at that time. And second, if not, how his descendants, how they will know that this time is come. Is there will be some sign, or how they will know this?
Yes, all right. If you like, all that is included. All that is included in these two words, Bama Eida. How will I know? So he's asking about himself. Avram Avinu says, how do I know whether what you've promised me will actually come to pass? Now you might think, is he questioning God? And he's not, of course, not questioning God. He's questioning my descendants, right? How will, as you put it quite rightly, how will they know? How will they know where to go and how to live? And it's important to understand the Bama Eida. really what he's asking is not just how will I know, but how can I be sure? Right? You're promising me something, but the promise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is a theme we find in Chazal quite a lot. The promises of HaKadosh Baruch Hu are eternal, but they depend on whether the recipients are worthy to receive the Chazdei Hashem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to give us chesed. He wants to give us all sorts of types of benefits. The question is only, are we worthy recipients? Right? If you look, for example, in the Maharal, I gave a whole course of shiurim many years ago on the Maharal and his writings on the essence of tefillah, his understanding of tefillah. And the Maharal is very interesting because he says in a few places that really the essence of tefillah is not, we're not trying to change God's mind. We're not trying to say, please help us with this and help us with that and do this for us and do that for us. We're not trying to change his mind. We're actually trying to change ourselves into becoming worthy recipients of Chazdei Hashem. If we are worthy recipients, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu is able to give us what he wants to give us. It's a bit like nowadays the young generation have never heard of listening to music on a radio. I don't know. I think people of this shir do still remember listening to broadcasts on a radio. Are there any radios anymore in this world? I don't even know whether radios still exist, right? I'm not sure. I think radios went out of the window with the gramophones and the reel-to-reel tape recorders. I think they're a bit of a relic of the past. But if you remember a radio, so a radio is a device which can pick up, let's say, for example, music, can pick up signals of music, but it has to be tuned in. Now, you can switch on the radio and tune it in, and then you can hear the music. What does that mean? Does that mean that when you tuned it in, that's when the music started playing? No, that's not what it means. The music is playing all the time, only you can't hear it. And why can't you hear it? Because you're not tuned in. As soon as you tune yourself into the right wavelength, you can get and to hear the broadcast, right? So in a similar way, says the Maharal, that what we're davening and asking from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whether it's health or parnasa or inspiration, or whether it's protection from our crazy enemies or whatever it is, what we need is to tune in, right? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to give us these things, that's axiomatic. That's part of our assumption. The question is only, are we able to receive it? So this is partly what Avram is asking here about more Eidah Kirashena. What guarantees do I have that my descendants will be able to tune in and receive from you, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that which you are promising them? And if you understand this question properly, then you're ready to understand why it was important for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to really enter into a brit, into a covenant. Because until then, he had said to Abraham, this is what I'm promising you, I'm going to give you this gift, I'm going to give you A, B, C, and D, the land of Israel and descendants and everything, but it hadn't yet been a brit. Abraham had never yet heard from HaKadosh Baruch Hu the word brit. The minute the word brit enters into the vocabulary of the Chumash, at that point, certain irrevocable truths are being created. As the HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm not only promising you that you will have children who will inherit Eretz Israel, I'm giving you a covenant. And if there's a covenant, that means in some way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is guaranteeing, right, that this will indeed take place, that this will happen. He's guaranteeing, I guarantee you, irrevocably, that your descendants will indeed be the sort of people that I'm talking about, that they will inherit the land of Israel, that they will inherit your spiritual destiny. So in other words, only if you understand properly the possible Ma'eda do you understand what really is being achieved here by this covenant. Let's go back to the text for a minute. So in his response to this question, Avraham Avinu asks, Bamo Eda, right? Bamo Eda, how will I know? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to him, here it is. Let's go through the ritual of a covenant. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of it. It is very interesting, actually. He said to him, you've got to take 3 calves and 3 goats and 3 rams and some birds and cut them in half, right? Exactly why there are 3 of these and 3 of those and why cut them in half. I'm not going to go into that for the moment. That's a separate shia, and you're welcome to look it up in the commentaries. It's very, very interesting. There's only one detail here that Rashi does pick up that I thought I would mention. Why is he chopping up all the big animals? But the birds that he's designated are 2 birds. You can see the Tor, Vagozo. Tor is a dove and a young bird, right? So then it says that he chopped up all the big animals, but the birds he didn't chop up. It was a tipolo bosor. The birds, he simply took them and consecrated them as part of the covenant, but he didn't. Why exactly he uses this ritual is a bit of a longer subject, but of course we see straight away, if anybody's understanding the whole biblical narrative, we see straight away the beginnings of what later on would become the korbanot, the sacrifices that are being made in the Beis Hamikdash. And later on, the tefillas that we do instead of the korbanot, you already have that here in this covenant. These are all animals, both the egel and the eiz and the ayil and the tor. These are all animals used in the Beis Hamikdash for the korbanos. But it's interesting that he chops up the animals, but he doesn't chop up the birds, says Rashi. So Rashi here says, look at this. He doesn't slaughter the birds. All these large animals are metaphors for the big empires of this world, right? The porim are the bulls and the rams and the goats. They are all metaphors for the large nations of the world. Shanema, Svavuni, porim Rabbi, and Posuk Tehillim, etc., etc. in Daniel, and then he says, "Seir Melech Yavam." Those are the psukim that Rashi chooses to bring, that the Torah uses a metaphor of the large animals, referring to the nations of the world. The Yisrael, but Klal Yisrael, in contrast, look at this. Sorry, bear with me for 1 second, ladies and gentlemen. My screen has gone a little bit crazy for reasons not entirely clear to me. Okay. It says here, Yisrael nimshalu lebnei Yonah. But in the contrast, the birds in the Bris Ben Absarim are reference to the Jewish people. Nimshalu lebnei Yonah. Shenema Yonosi b'chagvei hasel. Right, we just read Shir Hashirim over Pesach, and one of the psukim there refers to Klal Yisrael as Yonosi b'chagvei hasela. In actual fact, in the whole Shir Hashirim text, which is this romance between the Doidi and the Rayon, between the man and the woman representing HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Jewish people. So several times the man refers to his beloved, the beloved woman, as Yonati, my dove, right? Achosi, Rayosi, Yonosi, Tamosi. He's got these 4 words that he uses regularly to refer to his beloved wife, which is a reference, of course, to Klal Yisrael. So Klal Yisrael are Achosi, Rayosi, Yonosi, Tamosi. So one of the words is Yonati. Yonati. And in fact, Yonah has become quite a popular name for women, Yonah, which is interesting. I always found it interesting because, of course, in the Tanakh, Yonah was a man, not a woman, right? I'm not sure we find in the Tanakh any women called Yonah. I'm not sure. I can't think offhand. I'm sure somebody will correct me, but I don't think there is in the Tanakh any women called Yonah. But there is, of course, the famous Novi, the prophet Yonah, who was a man, not a woman. Anyhow, be that as it may, here the word Yonah is a reference to the actual bird, and Rashi is saying it's a metaphorical reference to Klal Yisrael. And what does it mean? Says Rashi here, look at this word remez. Remez means the symbolic message of this whole covenant. Sheyu, look at this. Sheyu ha'umos kolim v'holchim. That the great nations of these worlds will rise to fame and to power, and then they will diminish and disappear. The great empires of the world rose to incredible power and then diminished. But the bird is not like that. Remez sheyu Yisrael kayomin la'olam. That Klal Yisrael have an eternal destiny, right? That Klal Yisrael have a destiny that they are kayomin la'olam. That they will exist forever. So really what's going on here is, I want you to understand this. This is what I mentioned to you. That's what I'm mentioning to you about Sefer Bereshis. If you read carefully, properly through the eyes of Chazal, Sefer Bereshis gives us the building blocks for the whole of Jewish history and the whole of Judaism, right? And here we have a covenant that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving to Avraham Avinu. And part of that covenant, as Rashi tells us, is Sheyu Yisrael Kayomin La'olam, the concept of the, if you like, indestructibility of the Jewish people, right? And you only have to you read Jewish history at random, and you read about the terrible, the Churban, the destructions, the persecutions, the Crusades, the pogroms, the Holocaust, all the different stages that Klal Yisrael have had to endure. And the real miracle is the indestructibility of the Jewish people. That's the real miracle. The real miracle of Jewish history is that Klal Yisrael are not, cannot be destroyed. And why is that? And the answer is because they are Am Hashem. Because of the covenant in Bereshis chapter 15, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying to Avraham Avinu, your descendants by Yotzei Osa Chutza. Michael Gross said before, out of the box, right? Out of the box is a metaphor for an original idea. But this is more than just out of the box. This is out of the whole dynamics of the natural world. In the natural world, nations have rise to great military power, right? Great military power and great cultural power and financial power, and then they subside, right? Many of us are from the United Kingdom, right? You go back a couple of hundred years into European history, and Britannia rules the waves. It's hard to imagine that the United Kingdom, which is a tiny island off Europe, really ruled the world. The British Empire really stretched from one end of the world to another. Right? The empire was unbelievably powerful. We can't even imagine the wealth and the power of the British Empire for those couple of centuries. And yet, at a certain point, HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided that was enough. And England, returned to its normal size, and its normal sphere of influence, and it's no longer an empire.
Just a non-entity.
What do you say?
Just a non-entity.
I wouldn't say it's a non-entity. I mean, Britain certainly has certain remarkable strengths, but there's no question that relative to its size, the idea that England ran an empire, including, I don't know, India and Australia and Africa and Canada and America. I mean, basically the entire world from one end to another was under the British Empire. and the British colonies and the way and that was massive, totally massive. But then, as I say, the rise and fall of nations is the normal dynamics of all history. But what's interesting is that in the Brisbane Absarim, Avraham Avinu asks, "How do I know that they're going to that my descendants are going to survive at all? How do I know that they're going to come back to this land and build up this land and inherit the land of Israel and rebuild it? How do I know that?" So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, "Look, here it is. I'm going to give you a covenant. The secret lies in the word Brit. That covenant is the covenant which really gives Avraham Avinu a whole new perspective. He'd never heard from God before the word bris." Let's have a look. Let's have a look further on at the text. Here HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, this is the pasuk that we said in the Haggadah, right? In the Haggadah, Baruch Shomei Haftachosa Yisrael Baruch Hu, and we bring this pasuk, right? That and he promises to Avraham Avinu in some way, and this is also another very interesting thought about Pesach, is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu not only promised Yetzias Mitzrayim, but he promised Golus Mitzrayim. That in some way, the fact that the Jewish people went into the exile of Egypt, that somehow gave the Jewish people some sort of an iron, strong core, a strong core of beliefs and resilience and determination. So he says to him, "I'm going to put your descendants through," and Moshe Rabbeinu at a later date in Devarim refers to Golus Mitzrayim as the Kur HaBarza, as the furnace for purifying metal. In order to purify metal, you put it through a furnace, and that was Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim was the Kur HaBarzel, which on the one hand was a great suffering and slavery and deprivation, but on the other hand was extremely formative and extremely crucial for the future personality of the Jewish people, right? And then he says, "V'gam es hagoyshi avodah don anochi." I'm skipping through here a little bit because I want to get to a particular point before the end of the shir. And look, these are the concluding pasuk. This is the concluding pasuk of chapter 15. By Yomahu, on that day, Koras Hashem es Avraham Baris. Here we have for the first time in the text of the Chumash, 15 chapters into the Chumash. We've once had a bris before with Noach. Now we're getting another covenant with Avraham Avinu. Leimar, what is the covenant? And look at this. The covenant turns out to be focused on the land of Israel. It's very interesting. It turns out to be that the land of Israel is the key issue of the first covenant that Avraham has. Look at this text here. On that day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, gave a covenant to Avraham, saying, "L'zarachon asati es oris hazos." I've given them this land, and here we get. You're probably aware of the fact that within the Tanakh there are several different versions of the borders of the biblical land of Israel. Where are the boundaries of the biblical land of Israel? The first time we're introduced to the promise of the land of Israel, we get the largest boundaries that we get in the whole Tanakh. Can you see these are the boundaries? Minahar Mitzrayim Aranoah Hagodol Nahar Paras, from the Nile to the Euphrates. Now, if you take out a map, ladies and gentlemen, and have a look at the Nile to the Euphrates, it turns out that is massive, several times larger than the land of Israel that we are familiar with. And what is meant is, so here comes an interesting thing. There's a lot to be said about this. Books have been written about this. But one thing I will just pick up here, and that is that in this promise here, in this bris, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you know what this land is? This is a land which is currently inhabited as follows. It's inhabited as a Keni, a Knizi, a Kadmoni, a Chiti, a Prizi, a Rephaim, a Mori, a Kanani, a Girgoshi, a Yebusi. He gives him a list of all the current inhabitants of the land that he's going to get, and how many nations are mentioned here. So here's an interesting thing. If you count them, right, it's Keni, Knizi, Kadmoni, Chiti, Prizi, Rephaim, Amori, Kanani, Girgoshi, and Yebusi. 10 nations. This is a land which is currently owned by 10 nations, right? And that is going to be given to you as your homeland, right? What is interesting about that, these 10 nations? What's interesting is that later on in the Tanakh, I'm just going a bit fast now because it's only a few minutes of Shirat. If you have a look, for example, in Devarim chapter 7, right, I brought you here. So Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to the Jewish people, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will drive out the nations before you. And who are they? Shivas Goyim, Rabbi Batsumi Mimeka, 7 nations. When the Jewish people, here's an interesting thing. And this is really a subject for a whole separate share, but I'll just touch on it now. It's interesting that Avraham Avinu, in chapter 15 of the Bris Bein Absarim, is promised a land of 10 nations, right? When we actually get the land in Sefer Devarim, when they're just about to enter the land of Israel and Yeshua enters the land, it's repeatedly referred to as Eretz Shiv'at Amim, 7 nations. Does anybody remember anything at all about this? Why would it be? What happened to the other 3? Why is there a difference in the original promise and what, in fact, Klal Yisrael gets in the end? And what is that going to do with our geography? These are very, very fascinating topics, just by the way, for those people who want to do a bit of homework. Very fascinating to see what the Mefarshim say about this. But I'm just going to end the share today and share with you this Rashi. So Rashi's quoting Chazal. Rashi says, look at this Rashi. So Rashi says as follows. As Akeni, says Rashi, Eser Umos Yeshkan. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is promising to Avraham Avinu a land which is currently occupied by 10 different nations. But actually, when it came to it, Moshe Rabbeinu hands over to Yeshua, and he tells him that the land is the land of Shiv'at Amim. The Hashlishi, what are the other 3? So here's Rashi quoting Chazal. The other 3 are Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Right? And of course, we know that Edom is Esau, and Ammon and Moab are also our cousins, because they are the sons of Lot, right? So Edom, Moab, and Ammon are our 3 biblical neighboring countries, basically corresponding to Jordan and Syria. Jordan and Syria together, very approximately, combine Edom, Moab, and Ammon, and they are being referred to in the pasuk here. Vaheim, Knizi, Keni, Knizi, and Kadmoni. So Rashi says, Asidim lios Yerusha la'osid. According to Chazal, they will be eventually part of the inheritance that the Jewish people will get at the in the messianic vision. So in fact, Avraham Avinu is promised a land of 10 nations, including the whole of Israel, Jordan, and Syria, and that is really the large, from the Nile to the Euphrates. From the Nile to Euphrates is what is the Bris Bein Absarim, is the original promise. I'd like to point out that I'm not making any political statements here in this share. and I'm not engaging in any political agitation or activism or encouraging you to go out there and conquer Jordan and Syria. But I am saying to you that we have a Maseira, that originally the original promise to Avraham Avinu was a much greater land than the land we are familiar with as the land of Israel. But the original promise comes in Bereshit chapter 15, and it comes in the form of a covenant. It comes in the form of a bris, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this shir, is irrevocable. That was irrespective of what the Jewish people are going to do later on in life. They will come back to this land of Israel, and this land of Israel will remain your inheritance, come what may. And what's amazing is that for our grandparents and great-grandparents, and going back generations, this was really just a Rashi. This was just a pasuk, and it was a dream, right? Hayinu kecholmin. It was a dream. B'shuv Hashem es shivas tzia. Hayinu kecholmin. It was a dream to come back to the land of Israel, and we have all had the zechus, which is an amazing, amazing thought, which you must never forget. The tremendous zechus to be part of the unfolding covenant that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made with Avraham Avinu in Parshas Lech Lecha, in chapter 15. It's because of that covenant and because of the personal connection of Avraham Avinu he had with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he was guaranteed. He was saying, yes, Klal Yisrael will go through Mitzrayim and other sufferings, but the land of Israel is irrevocably part of the future of the Jewish people, and it's not dependent on circumstances. Circumstances could decide that it's completely impossible, right? If you would have spoken to somebody even a year before the War of Independence or a day before the War of Independence and asked them, what are the chances of the Jewish people building an independent Jewish country in the land of Israel, they would have given you a zero viability prediction, because in terms of human circumstances and politics and muzzle, it seemed like something totally beyond the possibilities. And yet here we are. And when you think about that, I want you to think about the Bris Bein Absarim. That was the first time that Avraham Avinu heard from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yes, of course it's true, you will have descendants who are not worthy, but you will also have some descendants who are worthy, and because of them, Eretz Yisrael is a part of the destiny of the Jewish people, irrevocably. And that's really our tefillah. So when you say Mogen Avraham is the key word to this whole chapter and this whole covenant and this whole piece of the jigsaw puzzle of what is called the Jewish people and Judaism and Jewish history. And that is really what I wanted to learn with you today. And of course, lots of paid a high sacrifice for the land of Israel. We have this week the Yom HaZikaron, both for the Shoah and for those who have fallen in battles for Israel and battles to protect Judaism. And all that was shown to Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu saw a horrific machazeh, a horrific vision, but within that horrific vision, he was also shown that Klal Yisrael would outlive and were destined to come back again and again and to be the Am Hashem, the indestructible nation. That's it for today, Rabbi Sai. Nice to see you all, and please God, we will go forward.
Explain the difference between the 7 and the 10? What happened between that promise?
So that's what Rashi said, that actually the additional 3 are Edom, Ammon, and Moab, which is basically Jordan and Syria, which is a promise for the Messianic period.
So what about the rest of the 7?
No, the 7 were given to Yeshua. Moshe Rabbeinu says to Yeshua, these 7 are this is the land that you're going to conquer and settle and that's going to be the land of Israel throughout Jewish history. But at the end of history, in our vision of the Messianic era, the land of Israel will expand to cover also all the other parts of the covenant with Avraham Avinu.